The last thing my wife, Elena, ever said to me was a warning. It wasn't, "I love you," or "take care of the kids," or even a final breathy goodbye as the light left her eyes. She gripped my hand with a strength that shouldn't have belonged to a woman dying of a sudden, catastrophic stroke, leaned toward my ear, and whispered, "Never go to Silverado Ridge, Silas. Promise me, it's just dust and ghosts. Let it stay buried." At the time, I thought she was delirious. We'd been married for 34 years, a lifetime of shared coffee, mortgage payments, and the quiet rhythm of a modest life in a suburb outside of Richmond. Elena Montgomery was the most transparent woman I knew. She clipped coupons, she volunteered at the local library, and she treated our 3 children, Julian, Caleb, and Clara, like they were the center of the universe. To me, Silverado Ridge was just some family lore, a patch of worthless scrubland in the harsh, wind-battered plains of Wyoming that her old money ancestors had lost during the Great Depression, or so she'd told me. I buried her on a Tuesday. By Friday, the silence in our house was a physical weight, a thick blanket of grief that made it hard to draw a full breath. My children had already scattered. Julian, my eldest, a high-powered defense attorney in D.C., hadn't even stayed for the post-funeral lunch. Caleb, who ran an investment firm that always seemed to be one deal away from a breakthrough, was back in Atlanta before the sun set on the grave. Only Clara, my youngest, stayed to help me pack up Elena's clothes. Though her eyes were constantly glued to her phone, her mind clearly miles away in her design studio in Chicago, I was alone when the call came from the office of Alistair Kensington. Kensington was a name that carried weight, the kind of lawyer who didn't take cases unless they involved 7 figures or congressional subcommittees. I'd never heard of him, yet he claimed to be the executor of my wife's private estate. "Mr. Harrison," Kensington said, his voice as smooth and cold as polished marble. "I realize you are in a period of mourning, but your wife was very specific. Certain matters must be settled within 72 hours of her passing. Please be at my office tomorrow morning at 10. I showed up in my only suit, the one I'd worn to the funeral, feeling like a moth in a cathedral. Kensington's office was all mahogany and hushed voices, perched high above the city. When he sat me down, he didn't offer condolences. He offered a heavy brass key and a thick manila envelope. "Your wife purchased a property in Caspian County, Wyoming 4 years ago," Kensington began, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "Silverado Ridge. She restored the mineral rights, settled the outstanding back taxes, and cleared the titles. According to her deed, the property and everything on or under it is now yours." I stared at the key. She told me it was worthless. She told me she hated that place. Kensington allowed himself a thin, humorless smile. "Mr. Harrison, Silverado Ridge sits on one of the most concentrated shale oil deposits discovered in the last decade, combined with the timber rights and the luxury lodge she had commissioned. The current valuation is approximately $85 million. The room tilted. My Elena, the woman who insisted we wait for the Labor Day sales to buy a new toaster, was sitting on $85 million. I felt a cold shiver crawl down my spine. This wasn't just a secret, it was a total transformation of the woman I thought I knew. Why hide it? Why work a part-time job at the library while she was a secret tycoon? "There is one more thing," Kensington said, his voice dropping an octave. "Your wife left a letter. She was adamant that you read it only once you arrived at the property. She said you'd need the context of the land to understand the choice she made." I left the office in a daze, the brass key burning a hole in my pocket. I should have called the kids. I should have told them their mother was a secret millionaire, but Elena's warning, "Never go to Silverado Ridge," echoed in my head. If she wanted me to stay away, why leave it to me? Why give me the key to the very door she told me to keep locked? I didn't know it yet, but the money was the least of my problems. The money was just the bait. What happened next changed everything, starting with the drive. I didn't fly. I needed the road. I needed the 2 days of driving across the heart of America to reconcile the Elena I loved with the Elena who had lied to me for 4 years. By the time I crossed the Wyoming border, the landscape had turned jagged and fierce. Caspian County wasn't a place for the faint of heart. It was a land of towering pines and deep, shadowed valleys where the wind sounded like someone screaming in the distance. The GPS led me off the main highway and onto a private, paved road that looked brand new. A massive wrought iron gate blocked the path, embossed with a silver M for Montgomery. I used the keypad code Kensington had given me, and the gates groaned open. I expected a shack, I expected dust. Instead, as I rounded the final bend, I saw a sprawling estate built of native stone and reclaimed timber, nestled against a backdrop of snow-capped peaks. It was magnificent. It was a palace in the wilderness. And surrounding it, hidden partially by the tree line, were the silent, rhythmic nods of oil pumps, pulling a fortune out of the ground every second of the day. I stepped out of my old Ford truck, feeling utterly out of place. The air was thin and sharp. A man emerged from a nearby workshop, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. He was built like a bear, with a weathered face that looked like it had been carved from the mountain itself. "You must be Silas," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I'm Miller Garrett. I've been the foreman here since your wife started the reclamation." "I've been expecting you. She really did all this?" I asked, gesturing to the massive lodge and the humming machinery. Miller nodded, his eyes unreadable. "She was a force of nature, Mr. Harrison. Spent 2 weeks out of every month here, for 3 years. Told you she was visiting her sister in Vermont. I reckon." My heart sank. The Vermont trips. She'd gone 4 times a year. I'd never doubted her, not once. "Yeah, Vermont. She worked harder than any man I've ever hired," Miller said. "But she wasn't just building a ranch. She was building a fortress. She said the day would come when you'd need a place where the world couldn't find you." I didn't understand what she meant until I saw the news of her passing. She knew her time was short. He handed me a heavy flashlight. "The house is open. Everything is exactly as she left it. But Silas, a word of advice. Don't go looking for answers in the bedrooms. Go to the basement. There's a steel door behind the wine cellar. That's where the real Silverado Ridge begins." I walked into the house, my footsteps echoing on the hand-scraped oak floors. The interior was decorated with Elena's unmistakable touch, warm, inviting, yet sophisticated. But the silence here felt different than the silence back in Richmond. It felt heavy with anticipation. I found the wine cellar easily enough. Behind a rack of expensive vintages I didn't recognize, I found the steel door Miller had mentioned. It didn't have a keyhole, it had a biometric scanner. I hesitated, then pressed my thumb against the glass. It chirped. A series of heavy bolts slid back with a mechanical clunk that resonated in my chest. The door swung open to reveal a staircase leading deep into the bedrock. This wasn't a basement, it was a bunker. As I descended, motion sensor lights flickered on, illuminating a room that looked like a high-end private investigator's office. There were monitors, filing cabinets, and a massive corkboard covered in photos and red string. My breath hitched. In the center of the board was a photo of our family from last Christmas, but red X's had been drawn over Julian and Caleb's faces. Only Clara's remained untouched. Below the board sat a laptop with a sticky note on the screen. "Play me, Silas." "I'm sorry." I sat in the leather chair, my hands shaking so hard I could barely hit the spacebar. The screen flickered to life, and there was Elena. She looked tired, her face pale, sitting in this very room. "Silas," she said, her voice cracking. "If you're seeing this, then I failed to outrun the clock. I'm so sorry for the lies. I'm so sorry for the secrets, but I had to protect you. Our sons, Julian and Caleb. They aren't the men you think they are, Silas. They've done something terrible, something that involves the Montgomery legacy and a debt that can only be paid in blood." She leaned closer to the camera, her eyes wide with terror. "They think I'm dead, and the secret died with me. They're coming for Silverado Ridge, Silas. Not for the oil, not for the money. They're coming for what's hidden in the safe behind you. Do not let them have it. If they get their hands on it, thousands of people will die, and our family name will be erased from history." Just as she was about to continue, I heard a sound from upstairs, the heavy thud of the front door being kicked open. "Dad?" It was Julian's voice, echoing down from the foyer. It wasn't his usual polished, professional tone. It was sharp, cold, and laced with a terrifying urgency. "Dad, I know you're here. We saw your truck. Come out, we just want to talk about Mom's gift." I looked at the monitor, then at the safe behind me, then at the heavy steel door that was the only thing between me and my eldest son. I realized then that my wife hadn't left me a fortune. She had left me a war. I stood in the darkness of that high-tech tomb, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Above me, the floorboards of the lodge groaned under the weight of my own flesh and blood. Julian's voice was joined by another Caleb, my middle son, the entrepreneur. "Check the kitchen, Caleb," Julian snapped. His voice had that sharp, litigious edge he used when he was deconstructing a witness in court. Mom was meticulous. "If there's a deed or a ledger, She wouldn't have just left it on the mantel. Dad's truck is outside, so he's here somewhere, probably hiding in the woods like a beaten dog. The contempt in his voice was a physical sting. I leaned back against the cold steel of the bunker door, the silence of the room amplifying the sound of my own ragged breathing. I looked back at the monitors. Elena's face was frozen in a pixelated scream of warning. My beautiful, quiet Elena. She had known. She had seen the rot in them long before I did. I remembered a summer, 10 years ago. At our old beach house in Virginia, Julian had just finished his first year at Harvard Law. We were sitting on the porch, and I'd asked him what kind of law he wanted to practice. He'd looked at me with eyes that seemed decades older than 23 and said, "The kind that wins, Dad. Right and wrong are for people who can't afford better." I'd laughed it off then, thinking it was just youthful bravado, the arrogance of a top-tier education. I didn't know it yet, but that was the first crack in the foundation of my family. And Caleb. My sweet, charismatic Caleb. He'd always been the one who could talk his way out of anything. I'd bailed him out of bad luck investments 3 times in 5 years. Each time, he'd hug me, smell like expensive bourbon and remorse, and promise he was on the verge of something big. I thought I was being a supportive father. Elena saw it differently. I remember her standing in the kitchen after the last check was written, her hands trembling as she washed the dishes. "You're not helping him, Silas," she'd whispered. "You're just funding the monster." I'd argued with her. I'd defended them. Now, trapped in a hole in the ground while they hunted me for my wife's corpse-warm fortune, I realized I had been the architect of my own heartbreak. I turned my attention to the safe behind me. It was a heavy, floor-mounted beast, an antique Montgomery piece that looked like it belonged in a 19th century bank vault. There was no digital keypad here, just a traditional dial. I didn't know the combination. I hadn't even known the safe existed 10 minutes ago. But Elena knew me. She knew I was a man of habits, a man who remembered the small things because I lacked the brilliance of the Montgomery line. I looked back at the sticky note on the laptop. "Play me, Silas. I'm sorry." I hit the spacebar again. The video resumed. "Silas," Elena said, her voice now a mere thread of sound. "If you're at the safe, remember our first night in the Richmond house. The date we finally called it ours. That's the key to everything I've kept from you. The boys. They think they've partnered with a man named Jax Vane. They think he's a venture capitalist. He's not, Silas. He's a butcher. He's the head of a shadow syndicate that buys up old family legacies, strips them bare, and uses the remains to wash blood money. Julian helped him draft the contracts. Caleb provided the investors, local retirees, our friends, people who trusted us. They've bled Richmond dry, and now they need the Montgomery mineral rights to cover the hole before the feds close in." She paused, a tear finally escaping and tracking through the makeup she'd worn to hide her illness. "I tried to buy the land back to stop them. I used every cent of my inheritance. Money I never told you about because I was ashamed of where it came from. But it wasn't enough to just own the land. I had to find the evidence of what they were doing. It's all in the safe, Silas. The ledgers, the recorded calls, the original contracts with Vane's signature. If they get it, they can burn the evidence and walk away billionaires. If you keep it, you can stop them. But you'll lose them forever." A loud crash echoed from directly above the bunker. They were in the wine cellar. "Julian, look at this," Caleb shouted. "The wine rack is off-center. There's a seam in the wall." "Move," Julian commanded. I heard the sound of heavy metal striking stone. They were using a sledgehammer or a crowbar. They were tearing the house apart. I scrambled to the safe. Our first night in the Richmond house. The 14th of May, 1992, 05:14:92. I spun the dial, left to 05, right to 14, left to 92. I heard a deep, satisfying clack from deep within the mechanism. I gripped the handle and pulled. The heavy door swung open on silent, greased hinges. Inside, there were no gold bars, no stacks of cash. There was a single, leather-bound ledger and a thick stack of legal documents tied with a black ribbon. On top of the stack sat a small digital voice recorder and a handgun, a sleek black Kimber, 45. I reached for the ledger first. I opened it to a random page and felt the blood drain from my face. It was a list of names I recognized. Our neighbor, Mr. Henderson, my old commanding officer from the reserves. The widow who lived 3 doors down. Beside each name was a dollar amount, life savings, pensions, 401 KS, and a stamp that said liquidated. My sons hadn't just made bad deals. They had systematically preyed on our own community. They had used the Harrison name, my name, as a shield to rob people who had nothing left. I picked up the voice recorder and hit play. "Listen, Vane." Julian's voice came through the tiny speaker, cold and arrogant. "My mother is the only hurdle. She's got the original deeds and she's being moral about it. Don't worry. She's old. Her health isn't what it used to be. Once the stress of the investment loss hits her, nature will take its course. Just make sure the paperwork for Silverado Ridge is ready for my signature the moment she's in the ground. My father is a non-entity. He'll do whatever I tell him." I felt a surge of nausea so violent I had to lean against the wall. They hadn't just waited for her to die. They had counted on it. They had weaponized the stress of their own crimes to kill their mother. "Dad! We know you're down there!" The voice was right outside the steel door now. The biometric scanner chirped unauthorized access. Then came the sound of a heavy blow against the door. Julian was trying to force the electronic lock. "Open the door, Silas," Caleb yelled, his voice cracking with a manic energy. "We know what Mom left you. We know about the Ridge. You don't know how to handle that kind of weight. You're a retired high school coach, for God's sake. Let us handle the business side. We'll make sure you're taken care of. A nice condo in Florida, no more cold winters. Just open the door." I looked at the Kimber, 45, sitting in the safe. I'd spent my life teaching young men about discipline, about honor, about the value of hard work. I'd spent 34 years believing I was a good father. What happened next changed everything. I didn't reach for the gun. Not yet. I reached for the ledger and the documents. I shoved them into a heavy tactical backpack Elena had left in the corner of the room. I realized then that Elena's warning wasn't just to keep me safe. It was a test. She wanted to know if I had the stomach to do what she couldn't. She wanted to know if I could be the one to finally hold our sons accountable, even if it meant destroying the family I'd spent my life building. The steel door groaned. A blue spark flew from the keypad. They were using a portable welder to bypass the electronics. In a few minutes they'd be inside. And they weren't coming for a hug. I looked around the room, desperate for an exit. That's when I noticed a second, smaller door hidden behind a rack of servers. It wasn't steel, it was wood, painted to match the shadows. I grabbed the gun, the backpack, and the laptop. I scrambled through the small door just as the main bunker entrance gave way with a deafening bang. I found myself in a narrow, dirt-walled tunnel that smelled of pine needles and damp earth. It slanted upward, lit only by the faint glow of my flashlight. I moved as fast as my old joints would allow, the sounds of my sons cursing fading behind me as they discovered the empty safe. "He's gone," Julian roared. "The safe is empty. He took the Vane files." "He couldn't have gone far," Caleb screamed. "Find him. If he gets those files to the authorities, we're dead, Julian. Vane will kill us before the cops even get a chance." I kept moving, the tunnel narrowing until I was crawling on my hands and knees. Finally, I saw a glimmer of moonlight ahead. I pushed through a screen of heavy brush and tumbled out onto a rocky ledge overlooking the valley. The Silverado Ridge Lodge sat below me, a glowing jewel in the darkness. 2 black SUVs were parked in the driveway, their engines idling. I saw figures moving through the house, flashlights cutting through the windows like searchlights. I pulled the backpack tight and started to move away from the house, toward the dense forest. I needed to get to the main road. I needed to find Miller Garrett, but as I reached the edge of the woods, a pair of headlights cut through the trees. A third SUV was coming up the private road. It wasn't the police. It was a sleek, matte black Range Rover. The vehicle pulled to a stop 10 yards from me. The driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, dressed in a sharp gray suit that looked out of place in the Wyoming wilderness. He had a face that looked like it had been molded from wet ash gray, lifeless, and terrifyingly still. Jax Vane. He didn't pull a weapon. He didn't scream. He just stood there, silhouetted by his own headlights, and looked at me. "Mr. Harrison," he said, his voice a melodic, terrifying purr. "I believe you have something of mine. Your sons are incompetent. They were supposed to handle this quietly. But I find that if you want a job done with the proper amount of permanence, you have to do it yourself." He took a step toward me, and for the first time in my life, I felt the cold, hard weight of a firearm in my hand. I pulled the Kimber from my waistband, but my hands were shaking so badly the barrel was dancing in the moonlight. "You won't use that, Silas," Vane said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "You're a builder, a teacher. You don't have the soul of a killer. Give me the bag and I'll let you walk into those woods. You can disappear. Tell everyone you were kidnapped. I don't care about you. I just care about my paperwork." I looked down at the lodge. I saw Julian and Caleb run out onto the porch, spotting us. They started sprinting toward the SUV, their faces contorted with greed and fear. "Dad, give it to him," Caleb shouted. "Just give him the bag and it's over. We can all go home." I looked at my sons. I looked at the man who had corrupted them, and then I looked at the dark, deep woods behind me. I realized then that Elena hadn't just left me a war. She'd left me the chance to be the man I always pretended to be. "You want the Montgomery legacy, Jax?" I said, my voice finally finding its steel. "Come and get it in the dark." I turned and bolted into the trees, the sound of 3 sets of footsteps heavy on my heels. I didn't know the woods, but I knew one thing. I was a Harrison, and this was our land. What I didn't know was that the woods held a secret even Elena hadn't mentioned. A secret that was about to turn this hunt into a massacre. The Wyoming night didn't just feel cold, it felt predatory. The wind whipped through the towering lodgepole pines, sounding like 1,000 whispered secrets being torn apart. I ran until my lungs felt like they were filled with crushed glass, the weight of the tactical backpack slamming against my spine with every uneven stride. I was 65 years old, and my knees were screaming, but adrenaline is a hell of a mechanic. It keeps the machine running long after the parts should have seized up. I could hear them behind me. They weren't even trying to be quiet anymore. Why would they? They had the numbers, the youth, and in Jax Vane's case, the cold-blooded experience of a man who viewed people as obstacles to be cleared. The beams of their high-powered tactical lights cut through the darkness, sweeping across the trunks like the eyes of some prehistoric beast. "Dad, stop!" Caleb's voice was high-pitched, bordering on a sob. "You don't know where you're going. There are drop-offs out there, old mine shafts. You're going to kill yourself." I didn't answer. I didn't even slow down. I knew exactly where I was going, even if I didn't realize it until that moment. I was following the scent of ozone and pine, moving toward the highest point of the ridge, a place Miller Garrett had pointed out earlier, the watchtower. As I climbed, my mind drifted back to the summers when the boys were small. I used to take them on survival hikes in the Blue Ridge Mountains. I'd teach them how to read a topographical map, how to find north by the moss on the trees, how to move silently so as not to wake the woods. I remember Julian, even at 8 years old, complaining that it was pointless because he was going to have a car and a driver someday. I'd laughed and told him that a man who can't walk his own land is a man who doesn't truly own it. I didn't realize then that I was training the very men who would eventually use those skills to hunt me down for a ledger. The terrain grew steeper, the soil turning into loose shale that threatened to slide out from under my boots. I reached a rocky outcrop and ducked behind a massive boulder, gasping for air. I pulled the Kimber, .45 from my waistband. The weight of it felt wrong, a tool of death in a hand that had spent 40 years holding whistles and chalk. I checked the magazine. Full. One in the chamber. "Silas, let's be reasonable." Julian's voice was closer now, projecting with that practiced courtroom authority. "You think you're being the hero here? You're carrying evidence that will implicate half of Richmond. Do you have any idea what that does to the town? The bank failures? The foreclosures? If you hand that bag over to the FBI, you aren't saving people. You're destroying the economy of the only home you've ever known." The manipulation was so pure, so perfectly Julian, that it almost worked. He was trying to frame his greed as a civic duty. That was always his gift, making the selfish seem selfless. "And what about the Hendersons, Julian?" I yelled back, my voice echoing off the canyon walls. "What about Mrs. Gable? Did you think about the economy when you drained her husband's life insurance policy? When you left her with nothing but a house she can't afford to heat?" There was a long silence. Then, a different voice. Jax Vane. "Mr. Harrison, your son is trying to save your feelings." "I'm not." The sound of a metallic click, a safety being disengaged. "I have men stationed at the bottom of this ridge. I have a helicopter 3 minutes out. There is no version of tonight where you walk away with that bag. But there is a version where your daughter Clara stays safe in Chicago." Do you think I didn't look into her, Silas? A struggling designer with a boutique that's 3 months behind on rent? It would be so easy for an investor to step in, or for a fire to break out. The world went still. My heart stopped. Clara, my baby girl. She was the only one Elena had left untouched on that board in the bunker. She was the only one left who still had a soul. If you touch her, I hissed, the words tasting like copper, I will bury you in this mountain myself. Then give us the bag, Caleb screamed, and I could hear the desperation now. He wasn't just afraid of Vane, he was afraid of the poverty he'd spent his life running from. Dad, please, Vane is serious. He'll do it, just throw the bag down and we can tell the feds you were confused by the grief. We'll say the stroke took Mom's mind first and she made it all up. I felt a hot, bubbling rage rise up in my chest. To hear them disparage Elena, the woman who had protected them until her final heartbeat, was the breaking point. I looked at the Kimber. I didn't want to be a killer, but I realized then that I wasn't fighting for money. I wasn't even fighting for the Montgomery legacy. I was fighting for the memory of the woman I loved. I didn't throw the bag. Instead, I pulled out the voice recorder and the laptop. I had a faint bar of signal. Silverado Ridge had its own private cell tower, part of the fortress Elena had built. I began uploading the audio files and the scanned ledger pages to a secure cloud drive I'd set up for the school's athletic department years ago. It was a slow crawl. 10%, 15%. I needed time. I picked up a heavy stone and shoved it into the side pocket of the tactical bag. Then I unzipped the main compartment and pulled out the ledger, stuffing it into the front of my jacket. I zipped the bag back up. All right, I shouted. I'm coming out, don't shoot. I saw the flashlight beams converge on my position. I stepped out from behind the boulder, the tactical bag held out in front of me. I looked down the slope. Julian and Caleb were standing about 20 yards away, looking disheveled and frantic. Jack's Vane stood slightly behind them, his gray suit somehow still pristine, his silenced pistol held loosely at his side. Smart man, Vane said, his eyes glinting in the moonlight. Hand it over. Dad, thank God, Caleb breathed, taking a step forward. You're doing the right thing. I promise, we'll take care of you. I looked at Caleb, really looked at him. I saw the weakness in his jaw, the fear in his eyes. He wasn't a monster, he was a coward. And cowards are often more dangerous because they have no floor to their morality. I'm not doing this for you, Caleb, I said quietly. I'm doing this because your mother deserves better than to have her name dragged through the mud by the likes of you. I swung the bag with all the strength I had left, tossing it not toward them, but out over the edge of the ravine. No, Julian screamed, lunging toward the edge. The bag tumbled into the darkness, disappearing into the thick canopy of trees hundreds of feet below. I knew the stone I'd put in the pocket would make it sink if it hit the creek at the bottom. You old fool, Vane hissed. He didn't hesitate. He leveled the pistol at my chest. But I wasn't standing still. The moment the bag left my hands, I dropped to the shale and rolled. A soft thwip sounded as a bullet whizzed past my ear, striking the boulder behind me with a spray of sparks. I didn't fire back. I couldn't bring myself to shoot toward my sons, even now. I scrambled backward, sliding down a hidden deer trail I'd spotted earlier. I heard Vane barking orders, the sound of boots hitting the shale as they scrambled down the ravine after the evidence. I didn't go down. I went up. I reached the watchtower 5 minutes later. It wasn't a modern structure. It was an old fire lookout from the 1940s that Elena had reinforced with steel and glass. It sat on the very pinnacle of Silverado Ridge, overlooking the entire valley. I ducked inside and slammed the heavy door, throwing the deadbolt. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Upload complete. I felt a brief moment of triumph, but it was short-lived. The watchtower was a beautiful vantage point, but it was also a trap. There was only one way in and one way out. I walked to the windows and looked down. The black SUVs were moving again, circling the base of the tower. Jack's Vane's voice came over a megaphone, distorted and metallic. You think you're clever, Silas? You threw a bag of rocks into a ravine. We found it in 2 minutes. The ledger wasn't in it, which means it's on you. And you're in a glass box at the top of a mountain. He was right. I had the ledger tucked into my jacket, the ink-stained pages pressing against my ribs like a second heart. I'm going to give you one last chance, Vane continued. Hand over the ledger, and I'll give you a clean death. Refuse, and I'll burn that tower down with you inside. I'll tell the world you couldn't handle the grief and ended it all in a blaze of glory. Your daughter will receive the insurance money, and nothing else. I looked around the small room. There was a cot, a small stove, and a desk. On the desk sat a framed photo. It was Elena, standing right here, looking out at the mountains with a look of absolute peace. Under the photo was a small handwritten note. Silas, if you're here, look under the floorboards by the east window. The Montgomerys never went down without a fight. I knelt and pried up the loose board. My heart stopped. It wasn't a weapon. It was a radio, a long-range emergency frequency transmitter, and beside it, a set of coordinates and a name, Blackwood. I didn't know who Blackwood was, but I knew the name. Silas Blackwood was the sheriff of the next county over, a man Elena had grown up with, a man the Montgomerys had trusted for generations. I grabbed the radio and keyed the mic. "This is Silas Harrison at Silverado Ridge. Do you copy? I have the Montgomery evidence. I am under fire." A burst of static, then a voice deep, gravelly, and sounding like a thunderstorm. "Silas, this is Blackwood. We've been waiting for your call for 3 years. Hold tight, son. We're already in the air." I looked out the window. Vane was walking toward the tower with a flare in his hand. Julian and Caleb were standing by the SUV, looking like ghosts in the headlights. But as Vane raised the flare, a new sound began to drown out the wind. The rhythmic, heavy thump-thump-thump of a massive Black Hawk helicopter crested the ridge, its searchlight blinding the men below. "Federal agents, drop your weapons." The world exploded into motion. Vane dived for cover. Julian and Caleb threw their hands up, but Vane wasn't done. He rolled and fired a shot toward the helicopter, then turned and aimed his pistol directly at the watchtower window. I saw the muzzle flash. I felt the glass shatter, but I didn't feel the pain. Not yet. I looked down and saw the red stain spreading across the front of my jacket, right over the ledger. I slumped against the wall, the radio still in my hand. "Blackwood," I whispered. "I have it. I have it all. Stay with me, Silas." The radio barked. I closed my eyes, the sound of the wind fading. I thought I saw Elena standing by the window, smiling at me. She looked beautiful. She looked proud. I didn't know it yet, but the cavalry hadn't just arrived to save me. They had arrived to reveal the final, most devastating twist of the Montgomery legacy. A twist that would mean my sons were never who I thought they were, in ways I couldn't even imagine. I didn't feel the cold of the Wyoming wind anymore. There was only a strange, rhythmic heat blooming in my chest, a heavy warmth that felt like a hand pressing down on my lungs. I looked at the red bloom spreading across the front of my canvas jacket, drenching the leather-bound ledger I'd tucked against my ribs. I thought about Elena. I thought about how she'd looked the day we bought the house in Richmond, young, radiant, and carrying a secret she had spent 3 decades keeping under lock and key. The glass of the watchtower continued to rain down around me in crystalline shards, shimmering like diamonds in the tactical searchlights of the hovering Black Hawk. Below, the world was a chaos of screaming engines and shouting men. "Target down! Move! Move!" The command echoed over the radio, but it sounded like it was underwater. I slumped against the mahogany desk, my fingers trailing over the framed photo of my wife. I waited for the darkness to take me. I waited for the pain to sharpen into that final, jagged edge. But instead of the end, I felt a sharp, metallic bite against my sternum. I reached trembling fingers into my jacket and pulled out the ledger. A flattened, distorted slug of lead fell onto the floorboards with a dull clink. The bullet had punched through the heavy leather cover, ripped through 200 pages of evidence, and buried itself in the center of an old, silver-encased fountain pen Elena had kept tucked in the binding. The blood wasn't mine. It was the antique crimson ink from the pen, shattered and leaking through the paper like a sacrificial offering. I wasn't dead. I was just broken, in a way a bullet could never manage. I heard the heavy thud of boots on the stairs, and the door was kicked open. Silas Blackwood burst in, his tactical vest heavy with gear, his face a mask of weathered granite. Behind him were 3 federal agents, their weapons leveled and clear. "Silas!" Blackwood roared, dropping to his knees beside me. He checked my chest, his hands fast and professional. He saw the shattered pen and the ink-stained ledger. He let out a breath that sounded like a prayer. "You're okay. Damn it, Silas. You're okay." "The ledger," I wheezed, my voice sounding like gravel in a blender. I have it. I have it all, Blackwood." "I know, son, I know." He signaled to the agents. "Get him down. Secure the perimeter. I want Vane in chains, and I want those 2 boys kept separate. Do not let them speak to each other." As they carried me down the winding stairs of the watchtower, I saw the aftermath of the Montgomery War. The ridge was flooded with blue and red lights. Jax Vane was face down in the shale, a federal agent's knee in the small of his back, his expensive gray suit ruined by the Wyoming dirt. He looked up as I was carried past, his eyes still burning with that gray, lifeless malice. He didn't look like a defeated man. He looked like a predator who was already calculating the cost of his next meal. But it was my sons who truly gutted me. They were being held by the SUVs. Julian was standing tall, his jaw set, already talking at a frantic pace to a man I assumed was a public defender or a federal liaison. Even in handcuffs, he was trying to dominate the space, his legal mind churning through 1,000 ways to spin the night into a tragedy of paternal confusion. Caleb, however, was a wreck. He was sitting on the bumper of the Range Rover, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with violent, silent sobs. When he looked up and saw me, saw the ink that looked like blood on my chest, he let out a strangled cry. "Dad! Dad! I'm sorry. It was Julian." He said we had no choice. He said Vane would kill us. "Shut up, Caleb." Julian's voice whipped across the clearing like a lash. "Don't say another word." I signaled for the agents to stop. I wanted to stand. My knees buckled, but Blackwood caught me, holding me upright as I faced the men I had raised. "You killed her," I said, the words quiet but carrying through the thin mountain air. "You didn't pull the trigger and you didn't swing the hammer, but you killed your mother. You knew the stress was destroying her and you kept twisting the knife." "We were trying to save the family, Silas," Julian spat, his eyes flashing with a terrifying, old-money arrogance. "Mom was obsessed with the past. She was sitting on a fortune while we were drowning in the reality of the 21st century. She owed us that land. It was her legacy, and she was going to let it rot out of some misplaced sense of honor for people who have been dead for 80 years. Honor for the people you robbed, Julian," I corrected him. "I saw the ledger. I saw the names." Julian took a step toward me, his face contorting. "You saw nothing. You're a high school coach from a nothing town. You don't understand how the world works at this level. You're a footnote in the Montgomery history, Dad. Just a placeholder until the real bloodline took over." The contempt in his voice was so pure it was almost beautiful. He didn't just hate me, he felt superior to me. He felt that his Montgomery blood made him a god among insects. Blackwood stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Julian. "You talk a lot about bloodlines, kid. It's funny you should mention that." He looked at me, then back at Julian, because while we were waiting for Silas to call from the tower, the Bureau ran a deep dive into the Montgomery estate records. Not the ones Elena hid in the safe, the ones she kept in a private medical vault in Switzerland. A cold wind swept over the ridge, and for a moment, the only sound was the idling of the helicopter. "Elena didn't just have a secret ranch," Blackwood continued, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. "She had a secret medical history. Silas. She was diagnosed with a rare genetic condition in her early 20s. A condition that made it biologically impossible for her to carry a child to term." I felt the world tilt. My heart skipped a beat, then another. "What are you talking about?" "I was there. I was in the delivery room for all three of them." Blackwood sighed, a sound of profound pity. "You were in a delivery room for a woman who had used an anonymous high-end surrogate agency in the late 80s. But that's not the part that matters, Silas." He pulled a small laminated card from his pocket, a copy of a birth record. "The father listed on the confidential surrogacy contracts wasn't you, Silas. It wasn't Silas Harrison. Elena had used a donor from the Sterling family, one of the oldest, most ruthless financial dynasties in the country. She wanted sons who would have the edge to survive the world she had grown up in. She wanted the Montgomery name to be carried by men with the Sterling ruthlessness." I looked at Julian. I looked at Caleb. I looked at the sharp, predatory lines of their faces, the coldness in their eyes that I had always tried to attribute to ambition. I looked for myself in them, for the Harrison chin, for the warmth I'd inherited from my own father, and found nothing. I had raised 3 strangers. I had spent 34 years loving a lie. "Dad?" Caleb whispered, his voice small and terrified. "What is he saying?" But Julian didn't look terrified. He looked enlightened. A slow, sickening smile spread across his face as the realization hit him. "Sterling? You're saying I'm a Sterling?" "I'm saying you're a criminal, Julian," Blackwood snapped. "And the Sterling edge is exactly what's going to get you a life sentence in a federal penitentiary." I felt a wave of nausea so powerful I had to turn away. I walked, stumbled, really toward the edge of the ridge, looking out over the valley. The oil wells were still pumping, their rhythmic heads nodding in the darkness, pulling wealth from the earth for a family that didn't exist. "Silas," Blackwood said, coming up behind me. "I'm sorry, Elena. She thought she was doing the right thing. She thought she was building a better version of you. She didn't realize that by choosing strength over soul, she was inviting the devil into her home." I looked down at the shattered pen in my hand. The crimson ink was staining my skin, a permanent reminder of a legacy built on deception. "She warned me," I whispered. "She told me never to come here. She knew if I found Silverado Ridge, I'd find the truth. She wanted me to live the rest of my life believing the lie because she knew the truth would kill me." "It didn't kill you, Silas," Blackwood said. "You're still standing." "Am I?" I asked. I looked back at the SUVs. The agents were loading Julian and Caleb into separate vehicles. Julian was already shouting at them, demanding his one phone call, his sterling arrogance fully ignited. Caleb was just a heap of misery in the back seat, a sterling with the soul of a coward. And then I remembered Clara. "Clara," I choked out. "What about Clara? Is she a sterling too?" Blackwood hesitated. He looked at his tablet, scrolling through the medical files. His face softened, a small, genuine smile breaking through the granite. "No, Silas, that's the thing. After 12 years of trying to manufacture the perfect heirs with the sterling DNA, Elena gave up. She realized she'd made a mistake. She went to a clinic in Virginia 4 years after Caleb was born. She used your samples, Silas. She wanted one child that was truly yours, one child that had your heart." He showed me the screen. Clara Elena Harrison, paternal match. Silas Harrison, 99.9%. I fell to my knees then, the tears finally coming. I wasn't alone. I wasn't a footnote. I had Clara. But as I sat there, weeping into the Wyoming soil, a new sound cut through the air. Not the helicopter, not the sirens. It was the sound of a massive, distant explosion. We all turned toward the north. A pillar of fire was rising from the horizon, right where the main Montgomery oil refinery sat. "Vane!" Blackwood hissed, turning to where the villain had been held. But the ground was empty. Jack's Vane was gone, and the agent who had been guarding him was slumped against the Range Rover, a needle sticking out of his neck. Vane hadn't come for the ledger. He hadn't come for the money. He had come to cauterize the wound. And he was just getting started. I didn't know it yet, but the betrayal was only half the story. The real war wasn't about who my sons were, it was about what Jack's Vane was planning to do with the Montgomery name now that the secret was out. What happened next changed everything. And it started with a phone call from Chicago. The fire from the refinery painted the horizon in a sickly, pulsating orange. A bruised sun rising in the middle of the night. It was a terrifying sight, a pillar of smoke and ash that seemed to reach up and choke the stars. I watched it from the ridge, the heat from the distant blast barely reaching us, yet I felt like I was standing in the center of the furnace. "Vane didn't just escape," Blackwood growled, his radio crackling with panicked reports from the refinery floor. "He's burning the paper trail. That refinery didn't just process oil, Silas. It processed the clean side of his money laundering operation. He's cutting ties." But I wasn't looking at the fire anymore. My eyes were fixed on the empty spot on the ground where Jack's Vane had been handcuffed. The agent who had been guarding him was being loaded onto a stretcher, his breathing shallow, his face a pale shade of blue from whatever neurotoxin Vane had kept hidden in his lapel. Vane was a man who planned for his own arrest like a CEO plans for a hostile takeover. He didn't just have an exit strategy, he had an execution list. My phone vibrated in my pocket. The screen didn't show a number, just a localized ID from Chicago. My heart did a slow, sickening roll in my chest. "Clara," I whispered. I answered the call, my hand shaking so badly I almost dropped the device into the shale. I expected to hear my daughter's voice, maybe crying, maybe scared. Instead, there was only the sound of a steady, rhythmic thumping, the sound of a luxury car idling, and then the smooth, terrifying purr of Jack's Vane. "It's a beautiful night for a drive, Silas," Vane said. His voice was perfectly calm, as if he weren't currently the subject of a multi-state manhunt. "The lights of the Chicago skyline are quite something from the top of a penthouse. Your daughter has an eye for design, I'll give her that. Her studio is exquisite. If you touch her, Vane," I said, my voice dropping into a register I didn't recognize. "There is no hole on this earth deep enough to hide you from me. Always with the threats, Silas. You're a high school coach. You teach boys how to throw balls and run in circles. Don't pretend you're a man of action. It doesn't suit the Harrison brand." I heard a muffled sound in the background, a gasp, followed by the heavy clink of a zip tie being pulled tight. My blood turned to ice. "I'm at Clara's studio." She was surprisingly easy to find. Apparently, Julian keeps very meticulous records of her security needs. He was even kind enough to give me the bypass codes for her alarm system months ago, just in case he ever needed to check in on her. I looked over at Julian. He was sitting in the back of a federal SUV, his head leaned back against the headrest, watching me through the tinted glass. He didn't look ashamed, he looked bored. He had handed Vane the keys to his sister's life like he was trading a pawn in a chess match. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice cracking. "I want the ledger, Silas. Not the digital upload my people are already working on the cloud drive you so clumsily tried to populate. I want the physical ledger, the one drenched in your wife's secrets. There are original contracts in the back binding, written on Montgomery vellum, that contain certain signatures from the Sterling Board of Directors. If those papers go public, the Sterling name becomes a toxic asset. And I've spent too much time building this syndicate to let a dead woman's guilt ruin my return on investment." Vane paused, and I could hear Clara's frantic breathing now. "I'm leaving Chicago. We're heading west. I'll call you when I'm 3 miles from the ridge. If I see a single flashing light, if I hear a single helicopter blade, I will leave your daughter on the side of the road in a way that will make you wish you'd stayed in Virginia. Do you understand, Coach?" The line went dead. I stood there in the dark, the weight of the ledger in my hand feeling like a mountain. I looked at Blackwood. He'd seen my face. He knew. "He has her," I said. "We can track the call, Silas. We can have a strike team in Chicago and—" "He's already gone, Blackwood. He's coming here. He wants the physical contracts." Blackwood's face hardened. "You can't give them to him. Those papers are the only thing that can bring down the entire Sterling Vane network. Thousands of lives. Silas, the people your sons robbed. This goes way beyond your family." I looked at the man I'd known for 40 years. I knew he was right. I knew that as a citizen, as a man of honor, I should hand the ledger to the feds and let them do their job. But I wasn't a federal agent. I wasn't a sheriff. I was a father, and I had just found out that I only had one child left who actually belonged to me. I didn't say a word. I just turned and walked toward the federal SUV where Julian was being held. The guard started to stop me, but Blackwood raised a hand, letting me through. I tapped on the glass. Julian didn't move. I tapped harder, using the butt of the Kimber. 45. He finally rolled the window down an inch, a smirk playing on his lips. "Looking for a father-son heart-to-heart, Silas? Or do you prefer Coach now that we know the truth about the bloodline?" "You gave him the codes to Clara's studio," I said. Julian shrugged. "It was a contingency. Business is about leverage, Dad. You taught me that, even if you didn't realize it. You always said to have a backup plan." Vane was the backup. If Mom got cold feet, or if you got heroic, I needed a way to keep the deal moving. "She's your sister, Julian. We raised you together. You taught her how to ride a bike. You held her hand when she scraped her knee." Julian leaned forward, his eyes cold and empty, reflecting the orange glow of the refinery fire. "No, Silas, you raised her. I was just observing. Even back then, I knew I was different. I felt the edge Blackwood was talking about. I didn't feel love. I felt curiosity. I watched you and Mom play act at being a happy family, and I wondered when the real world would finally break through the veneer. It took 32 years, but here we are. The Sterlings are built for this. You Harrisons, you're just the soil we grow in." I wanted to kill him. I wanted to reach through that gap in the window and squeeze the life out of the boy I'd once tucked into bed. But I realized that would be giving him exactly what he wanted. He wanted me to be a monster like him. He wanted proof that everyone had a breaking point. "You're not a Sterling, Julian," I said, my voice steady. "A Sterling is a man of power. You're just a puppet with a fancy degree. Vane is the one in charge. You're just the errand boy who sold his sister for a seat at a table that's about to be chopped up for firewood." The smirk vanished. For the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine rage in Julian's eyes. I'd hit the one thing he cared about, his ego. "Get him out of here," I told the agents. I walked back to Blackwood. "I need a car, and I need 20 minutes alone with that ledger. Silas, I can't let you." 20 minutes, Blackwood. Or I burn the ledger right here and you can explain to the Bureau why the biggest case of the decade went up in smoke because you wouldn't let an old man say goodbye to his wife's secrets. Blackwood stared at me for a long time. Then, he tossed me the keys to his personal Chevy Tahoe. 20 minutes. My GPS is active. If you try to run, I'll have to treat you like a fugitive. I sat in the Tahoe, the interior smelling of stale coffee and gun oil. I opened the ledger to the very back, where the vellum pages were tucked into a hidden slit in the binding. I pulled them out. The signatures were there. Alexander Sterling, Marcus Sterling, Silas Vane, Jax's father. It was a blood oath of a contract, dating back 20 years. detailing the systematic dismantling of local Virginia economies to fund a private military venture in Eastern Europe. My wife hadn't just discovered a Ponzi scheme, she had discovered a treasonous conspiracy. But then, I saw something else. A small, folded piece of parchment tucked between the contracts. It was a letter from Elena, dated only 2 weeks before her stroke. Silas. It read, "If you are reading this, the boys have chosen the Sterlings over us. I knew they would. It's in the marrow, but there is one thing Jax Vane doesn't know. He thinks the Montgomery legacy is the land. He thinks it's the oil. It isn't. The real legacy is the Caspian Protocol. In the 1920s, my grandfather didn't just find oil. He found a massive natural gas pocket directly beneath the Silverado Ridge Lodge. He rigged the house, Silas. He built it so that if the ridge were ever taken by force, it could be leveled in an instant. The trigger isn't a bomb. It's the water pressure system in the basement. Turn the master valve in the boiler room 3 times to the left, and the house becomes a tomb." My breath hitched. Elena hadn't just built a fortress, she had built a trap. She knew Vane would come here. She knew he'd want the physical evidence, and she had given me the ultimate Hail Mary pass. But there was a catch. Clara. If I triggered the protocol while Vane was in the house, I'd be killing my daughter too. I tucked the letter into my pocket and the contracts back into the ledger. I had 18 minutes left. I didn't spend them crying. I spent them thinking like a coach. I mapped out the field. I looked at the players. Vane was the quarterback, fast, arrogant, and prone to showboating. Julian and Caleb were the blockers, disposable, and distracted. I needed a wide receiver. I looked through the windshield and saw Miller Garrett standing by the barn, watching the feds with a grim expression. I stepped out of the car and walked over to him. "Miller," I said, "how well do you know the underground tunnels?" Miller spit a stream of tobacco into the dirt, better than the man who dug them. "Your wife had me map every inch when we did the restorations. Why? I need to get into the boiler room without Vane seeing me. And I need someone to be at the exit of the tunnel by the creek. Someone I can trust with a life." Miller looked at the fire on the horizon, then back at me. He saw the ledger, the ink, and the desperation in my eyes. "I liked your wife, Silas. She was the only Montgomery who ever gave a damn about the people who worked this dirt. If you're planning on taking that gray-suited bastard down, I'm in. I need you to wait for my signal," I said. "It'll be a flare from the watchtower. When you see it, you have 60 seconds to get whoever is in that tunnel out and down to the water. Do you understand? 60 seconds. "Got it, coach." I walked back to the Tahoe just as Blackwood approached, checking his watch. "Time's up, Silas." "What's the plan?" "The plan is to wait," I said, leaning against the hood. "Vane is coming. He thinks he's the one holding the whistle. But he forgot one thing about playing on someone else's home turf." "What's that?" "The home team knows where the soft spots in the grass are." The next 4 hours were a grueling test of nerves. The refinery fire began to die down, leaving a charred, skeletal silhouette against the pre-dawn sky. The federal teams had set up a perimeter, but per my instructions and Vane's threats, they stayed out of sight, hidden in the tree line and the outbuildings. Then, the roar of an engine broke the silence. The matte black Range Rover crested the ridge, its headlights cutting through the mist like twin sabers. It pulled to a stop in the center of the driveway, right in front of the lodge. The doors opened, and Jax Vane stepped out, looking as if he'd just stepped out of a spa rather than a cross-country kidnapping. He reached back into the car and dragged a figure out with him. Clara. She was pale, her clothes disheveled, her hands bound in front of her. But when she saw me, her eyes didn't fill with tears. They filled with a fierce, burning resolve. She was a Harrison through and through. "The ledger, Silas!" Vane shouted, his voice echoing off the stone walls of the lodge. "Bring it to the porch, alone." I looked at Blackwood. He gave me a sharp nod. His snipers were in position, but they couldn't take the shot, not with Clara used as a human shield. I started walking down the slope, the ledger held tightly against my chest. Every step felt like a mile. My knees ached, my heart was a frantic drum, but my mind was clear. I was walking onto the field for the final play of the season. "That's far enough," Vane said as I reached the bottom of the porch steps. He pulled a small silver-plated pistol from his waistband and pressed it against Clara's temple. "The bag. Toss it up." "I want to see her first," I said. "I want to know she's okay." Vane sighed, the sound of a man bored by sentiment. He shoved Clara forward. She stumbled, nearly falling, but I caught her eyes. I gave her a tiny, imperceptible wink, the same one I used to give her before her dance recitals when she was nervous. "Trust me," it said. "I'm okay, Dad," Clara whispered, her voice surprisingly strong. "Don't give it to him. Whatever is in there, it's not worth it." "It's okay, honey," I said. "It's just paper." I tossed the ledger onto the porch. Vane stepped on it, as if claiming a trophy, his eyes never leaving mine. He reached down and picked it up, flipping through the pages until he found the vellum contracts at the back. He let out a short, sharp laugh. "Beautiful. My father died trying to get his hands on these, and all it took was a little family motivation." "You have what you want," I said. "Let her go." Vane smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen. "In a moment. But first we're going inside. I want to make sure the digital backups in that bunker are truly gone. And I think it would be poetic if you and your daughter were there to watch the Montgomery legacy finally be deleted." He gestured with the gun toward the front door. We walked into the lodge, the air inside smelling of lavender and old wood, Elena's scent. It felt like a desecration. As we moved through the foyer toward the wine cellar, I lagged slightly behind. Vane was focused on the stairs, his ego blinded by the prize in his hand. I looked at the hallway mirror. I could see the reflection of the boiler room door just around the corner. "Go on," Vane urged, shoving Clara toward the bunker entrance. "I need to get some water," I said, stopping by the kitchen. "My throat is parched." "Make it fast," Vane snapped. I stepped into the kitchen, but I didn't go for the sink. I dived into the boiler room. I saw the master valve, a heavy, rusted wheel, painted red. I grabbed it with both hands. 3 times to the left. I turned it. The pipes began to groan. A deep subterranean rumble started to shake the floorboards. It wasn't the sound of an explosion, it was the sound of a massive, ancient pressure release. "Silas, what are you doing?" Vane's voice roared from the hallway. I burst back out of the boiler room, grabbing Clara by the arm. "Run!" I screamed. We didn't head for the front door. We headed for the small wooden service door behind the servers, the entrance to the tunnel. Vane fired a shot. The bullet shattered a vase next to my head, but we were already through the door, tumbling into the dark, dirt-walled passage. I slammed the door shut and bolted it. "The tunnel! Clara!" "Run as fast as you can." The rumble was getting louder now, a deafening roar that sounded like the mountain itself was screaming. The ground beneath our feet was vibrating so violently I could barely stay upright. We sprinted through the darkness, our breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind us, I heard Vane screaming, the sound of him trying to kick in the service door. But then, there was a different sound. A wet, sucking thud, followed by the sound of rushing air. We reached the end of the tunnel, the moonlight visible through the brush. Miller Garrett was there, his massive hands reaching in to pull Clara out. "Go! Go!" I shouted, shoving her toward him. I looked back one last time. The lodge above us was literally sinking into the earth. The natural gas pocket hadn't exploded, it had collapsed, creating a massive sinkhole that was swallowing the entire Silverado Ridge estate whole. I saw the service door splinter open. Jax Vane's face appeared in the gap, his eyes wide with the realization that he'd been beaten by a man he considered a non-entity. Then, the roof of the tunnel caved in. I dived out of the exit just as the ridge settled, a massive cloud of dust and debris billowing into the night air. I landed hard in the creek, the cold water shocking my system. I looked up. The lodge was gone. The oil wells were silent. The only thing left of Silverado Ridge was a jagged, smoking crater in the side of the mountain. "Dad!" Clara was at my side, pulling me from the water. I sat on the bank, gasping for air, watching the dust settle. Blackwood and the federal teams were descending from the ridge, their flashlights dancing over the ruins. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the leather-bound ledger. Vane had been so busy gloating over the vellum contracts that he hadn't noticed I'd swapped the ledger for a fake one I'd filled with blank school grade books from the Tahoe's back seat during my 20 minutes of privacy. The real contracts, the real evidence, was still with me. I looked at Clara, then at the ruins of the Montgomery legacy. I realized then that Elena's final warning wasn't just about the secrets. It was about the cost of keeping them. She had sacrificed everything to give me the tools to end the war. But as I watched the feds begin to dig through the rubble, I saw something that made my heart stop once more. A single, gray-suited hand was reaching out from the debris near the creek bed, and it was holding a flare. I didn't know it yet, but the final twist of the Montgomery story wasn't buried in that hole. It was just beginning to breathe. The flare didn't just burn. It hissed with a malevolent magnesium-white intensity that blinded the night. It wasn't a cry for help, it was a beacon. I stood on the muddy bank of the creek, clutching Clara to my side, watching that single gray-suited hand disappear back into the shifting shale as the earth continued to groan. For a second, I thought the mountain would finish what the Caspian Protocol started. But then, the sound changed. The heavy, rhythmic thrum of the Black Hawk was joined by something faster, sleeker, too unmarked, matte black little bird helicopters, screaming over the northern ridge, flying without lights, their presence a jagged violation of the airspace. "Blackwood, get down!" I screamed, pulling Clara behind a massive lichen-covered boulder. They didn't fire on us. They fired on the federal perimeter. A rain of non-lethal flashbangs and smoke canisters turned the crater into a hellscape of white noise and gray fog. In the chaos, a winch line dropped from the lead helicopter directly into the maw of the sinkhole. It was a precision extraction. Jax Vane wasn't a man who left his life to chance. He had a private tactical team on standby for the moment. His heart rate spiked or his GPS went static. By the time the smoke cleared and the wind from the rotors died down, the helicopters were gone, and so was Jax Vane. "He's gone," Blackwood spat, wiping soot from his forehead. He looked at the crater where the lodge had stood, then at the federal agents who were coughing and staggering through the mist. "He's gone," and he took the Sterling contracts with him. I felt the weight of the actual ledger inside my jacket, the leather cool against my ribs. "No," I whispered. He took a bag of blank school papers and some old gym schedules. "I still have the truth, Blackwood." I thought that would be the moment of victory. I thought the sheriff would clap me on the back, take the evidence, and the world would right itself. But as the sun began to bleed over the Wyoming horizon, painting the ruins in a cold, unforgiving light, a fleet of black Suburbans different from the ones the feds had used tore up the ranch road. They didn't have FBI or DEA on their jackets. They wore charcoal suits and earpieces. In the lead car was a man who looked like a more weathered, more terrifying version of Julian. This was the source of the rot. This was Harrison Sterling, the patriarch of the dynasty Elena had secretly feared. "Sheriff Blackwood," the man said, stepping out of the car with the practiced grace of a king. His voice was a baritone rasp that commanded the very air. "I am Marcus Sterling. I have a federal injunction signed 2 hours ago by the Fourth Circuit. This site is now a matter of national security. Your jurisdiction ended at midnight." "National security?" Blackwood stepped forward, his hand on his holster. "This is a multiple homicide investigation and a kidnapping, Sterling. I've got 2 of your assets in my SUVs right now." Sterling didn't even look toward Julian or Caleb. He looked at me. His eyes were like chips of frozen sea glass. "You must be the coach. My daughter-in-law spoke of you with, well, she didn't speak of you much at all," which was her first mistake. Her second was thinking she could bury a Sterling legacy in the dirt. He gestured to the men behind him. They moved with military precision, disarming the federal agents who had been under Blackwood's command. It wasn't a firefight, it was a bureaucratic execution. The injunction gave them total control over the recovery of all materials on Silverado Ridge. "The ledger, Mr. Harrison," Sterling said, extending a hand. "Hand it over, and we can discuss a comfortable retirement for you and your daughter. Refuse, and you'll find that the legal system in this country is a very small, very dark room." I looked at Blackwood. He looked at the ground, his jaw tight. He was outgunned, outranked, and neutralized by a piece of paper. This was rock bottom. I had the truth in my hand, and the men who owned the truth were standing right in front of me, ready to erase it. "I don't have it," I lied, my voice steady. "It went down with the house. Vane took the only copy." Sterling's eyes narrowed. He walked toward me, his presence like a cold front. He leaned in close, smelling of expensive tobacco and something sterile. "Silas, I've spent 50 years reading men. You're a terrible liar, but keep it for now. Hold on to that little book like it's a life raft. Just know that every person who ever looked at you with respect, every neighbor in Richmond, every player you ever coached will watch as your name is dragged through the sewers. By noon, the news will report that you murdered your wife for her secret fortune and blew up this lodge to hide the evidence. Your daughter will be an accomplice." He turned to his men. "Take the boys, they're coming with us." "Wait," Caleb screamed as they dragged him from Blackwood's SUV. "Dad, tell them we're Sterlings. Tell them I'm part of the family." Marcus Sterling stopped and looked at Caleb. It was the look a man gives a stray dog he's about to put down. "You're not a Sterling boy. You're a failed experiment. You'll spend the next 20 years in a facility where the sun doesn't shine, answering questions about Jack's Vane's offshore accounts. You're the scapegoat. It's the only thing you're actually good for. The scream that came out of Caleb was the sound of a man realizing his entire identity was a death sentence. Julian, ever the lawyer, remained silent, but I saw the mask slip. For the first time he looked small. He looked like a Harrison. They left us there, standing in the dust of our life. Blackwood was forced to hand over his badge pending investigation. The refinery fire was being called an industrial accident. The sinkhole was a geological anomaly. The Sterlings were rewriting history in real time. Clara and I were escorted to the edge of the property and told never to return. We sat in my old Ford truck, the only thing I had left, and watched the Sterling convoy disappear. "What do we do now, Papa?" Clara whispered. She was shivering, tucked under a greasy moving blanket I'd kept in the back. "They took everything. They're going to destroy your name. Nobody will believe us." I looked at the ledger. I looked at the ink-stained pages. I realized Sterling was right. I was just a coach. I didn't have billions. I didn't have helicopters. I didn't have a seat at the table. But I knew something they didn't. I knew the players. I reached into the glove box and pulled out my old coaching whistle, the one I'd carried for 30 years. I gripped it until the metal bit into my palm. They think they've won because they own the referees and the stadium, Clara, but they forgot how the game is actually played. They're playing for power. We're playing for the people they stepped on to get it. I looked at the ledger again, but this time, I wasn't looking at the Sterling signatures. I was looking at the list of victims. The Hendersons. The Gables. The hundreds of ordinary people whose lives had been liquidated to fund the Sterling edge. I remembered what Elena wrote in her last letter. The real legacy is the people. "We're not going to the police, Clara," I said, starting the engine. The truck roared to life, a low, defiant growl. "And we're not going to the press. Not yet. We're going back to Richmond. I'm going to call in every favor, every former player, every parent, and every honest soul I ever taught. We're going to build a different kind of army." I didn't know it yet, but my wife had left me one last secret. Hidden in the very back of the ledger, beneath the Sterling contracts, was a series of bank account numbers, not for Elena, but for a community trust. She hadn't just been documenting the theft. She'd been clawing the money back, cent by cent, for years. There was $400 million in that trust, and the only person with the authorization to release it was the head coach of Silverado Ridge. The reversal had begun. The Sterlings wanted a war. They were about to find out what happens when you try to take the field against a man who has nothing left to lose and an entire community at his back. "Drive, Dad," Clara said, her eyes turning as sharp as mine. "Let's go home and get to work." But as I put the truck in gear, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "I'm still breathing, Silas, and I'm coming for the girl first. Jack's Vane. He was alive, he was hurt, and he was hunting. The game wasn't over. It had just moved into overtime. And in overtime, the first person to make a mistake dies." The drive back to Virginia was a descent into a nightmare I'd spent 40 years trying to avoid. We didn't take the interstates. We stuck to the gray veins of the American map, the two-lane highways where the gas stations still have rusted pumps and the diners serve coffee that tastes like battery acid and regret. Every time a black SUV appeared in the rearview mirror, my heart would lurch into my throat. Every time a headlight flickered behind us on a dark stretch of Nebraska road, I'd grip the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Clara sat in the passenger seat, her head resting against the window, staring at the passing cornfields with eyes that looked like they'd seen the end of the world. Because for her, they had. On the second night, we stopped at a Greasy Spoon in Missouri. I sat in a back booth, the ledger hidden in a laptop bag between my feet, and watched the flickering television mounted above the bar. "Tragedy in the West," the news anchor said, her voice dripping with practiced sympathy. "New details are emerging in the Silverado Ridge explosion. Local authorities in Wyoming have issued an arrest warrant for Silas Harrison, a retired Virginia educator, in connection with the deaths of several security contractors and the suspected murder of his wife, Elena Montgomery Harrison." My picture flashed on the screen. It was my school ID photo from 5 years ago. I looked happy. I looked like a man who spent his Saturdays mowing the lawn and his Sundays at church. Sources say Harrison may have suffered a mental break following the discovery of his wife's secret estate. The reporter continued. His children, Julian and Caleb Harrison, are reportedly in protective custody after their father allegedly attempted to hold them for ransom at the site. I felt the air leave the room. I looked at Clara. She was staring at the screen, her jaw hanging open. They weren't just taking my land. They were erasing my soul. They were making me the villain of my own life. Marcus Sterling had moved faster than a wildfire. By morning, every person I had ever known would see me as a monster. "We have to go," I whispered, dropping a 20 on the table. We didn't sleep. I drove through the night, fueled by caffeine and a cold, vibrating fury. As we crossed the state line into Virginia, the familiar rolling hills of the Piedmont felt like a cage rather than a home. We entered Richmond at 4 a.m. I didn't go to our house. I knew what would be waiting there: yellow tape, news vans, and probably a team of Sterling's security experts. Instead, I drove to a part of town most people tried to forget. The Northside gym was a brick box with no windows and a door that had been kicked in so many times the frame was mostly wood filler and prayer. I pulled the truck into the alley and killed the lights. "Who are we meeting, Dad?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. "A man who owes me his life," I said, "and a man who knows how to fight a war when the rules don't apply." I knocked on the back door, a specific rhythm I hadn't used in 15 years. A sliding eye slot opened. A moment later, the door creaked open. Garrick, the ghost. Vance stood there. He was 6'4", a mountain of scarred muscle and ink. 20 years ago, he'd been the starting linebacker on my first state championship team. He'd been headed for the NFL until a bad decision and a worse crowd landed him in a courtroom facing 20 years. I was the only one who stood up for him. I'd spent my own savings on his lawyer and testified for 3 days straight about the man I knew he could be. Garrick didn't play in the NFL. He became a private investigator, the kind people hire when the police are the ones they're running from. "Coach," Garrick said, his voice a low rumble. He looked at my face, then at the ink-stained jacket, then at Clara. He didn't ask questions. He just stepped aside. "Get inside. The coffee's hot, and the perimeter is set." Inside the gym, the air smelled of sweat and old leather. Garrick had turned the upstairs office into a command center. Monitors showed feeds from the street and the alley. "I saw the news, Coach," Garrick said, sitting behind a desk cluttered with hard drives. "The Sterlings are playing for keeps. They've frozen your accounts, put a lien on the house, and there's a $500,000 information reward out for you. In this town, that's a lot of incentive for people to remember things that didn't happen." "I have the ledger, Garrick," I said, laying the laptop bag on the desk, "and I have the trust." I explained the community trust. Garrick's eyes widened as I detailed the numbers. $400 million. Elena wasn't just documenting the theft, I said. She was intercepting the Sterling's laundry. She used their own shell companies to divert the funds into an account they couldn't touch without exposing their own treason. But there's a catch. To activate the trust, I have to physically be at the First National Bank of Richmond, the main branch. The one on Main Street. Garrick let out a long, low whistle. The Main Street branch is basically a Sterling fortress. Their corporate offices are on the top 3 floors. You walk in there, you're walking into the lion's mouth. "I'm not walking in as Silas Harrison," I said. "I'm walking in as the head coach." "What does that mean?" Clara asked. "It means we're running a play," I said. I looked at Garrick. "How many of the '06 team are still in town? How many of the boys from the 12 championship?" Garrick's mouth twisted into a slow, predatory grin. "Most of them. Half of them are cops. A third of them work in construction. And the rest? Well, the rest work for me. You tell me the time and the place, Coach. They'll show up. You were the only father some of those boys ever had." For the next 6 hours, we didn't plan a legal defense. We planned an ambush. I used Garrick's secure line to make calls. "Hey, Jax," I'd say when a former player answered. "It's Coach Harrison. I'm in the 4th quarter, and I'm out of timeouts. I need you on the field." Not one of them hesitated. Not one of them mentioned the news. They knew me. And more importantly, they knew what the Sterlings had done to the town. The Sterlings had closed the mills, foreclosed on the farms, and turned Richmond into a playground for the elite, while the people who built it struggled to buy groceries. By noon, we had 20 men and women assembled in the basement of the gym. It was a motley crew: a high school principal, 2 detectives, a foreman, and a group of guys who looked like they'd been through a meat grinder. "All right, listen up," I said, standing in front of a chalkboard. I drew a diagram of the bank. "The Sterlings think they've won because they've framed me. They think I'm hiding in a hole somewhere. They don't expect me to walk into their front office at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday." I laid out the play. We weren't going in with guns. We were going in with the one thing Marcus Sterling couldn't buy: numbers. But as we were about to move, the gym's alarm system began to wail. One of the monitors showed a black Range Rover idling in the alley. The driver's side window rolled down. Jack's Vane. He didn't have a tactical team this time. He was alone, his face bandaged, one arm in a sling. He looked like a man who had crawled out of the grave. He looked at the camera and held up a phone. My phone buzzed. It was a video call. I answered it. "You're getting better at this, Silas," Vane said, his voice raspy from the smoke he'd inhaled. "But you're still thinking like a coach. You think a bunch of former football players can stop a man who has nothing left but his hate. What do you want, Vane?" "I want to tell you a secret, the one Elena didn't put in the ledger. The one Marcus Sterling doesn't even know." Vane coughed. A wet, rattling sound. "Why do you think the Sterlings wanted the Montgomery land so badly? You think it's the oil? The gas? No. In 1944, Marcus Sterling's father made a deal with the government. Silverado Ridge isn't just a ranch, it's a burial ground. Not for people, for something else. Something the government is willing to kill to keep hidden." Vane leaned closer to the screen. "I'm not here to fight you anymore, Silas. I'm here to watch you burn. Because even if you activate that trust, even if you win the bank, you've already lost. Look at your daughter." I spun around. Clara was standing by the water cooler, her face turning a terrifying shade of gray. She clutched her throat, her eyes bulging. "The water," Vane whispered. "I didn't need to get inside, Silas. I just needed to know which pipe fed the gym. It's a fast-acting paralytic. She'll be dead in 10 minutes unless you give me the location of the Sterling Vellum contracts. The real ones." I looked at my daughter as she collapsed to the floor. The community trust was the reversal I needed, but Jack's Vane had just reminded me of the one rule I'd forgotten. "In a war of legacies, there are no sidelines. I'll give you whatever you want." I screamed into the phone. "Good," Vane said. "The contract's for the girl's life. Meet me at the old stone bridge in 15 minutes. Alone. If I see a single player, she stops breathing." I looked at Garrick. I looked at the ledger. I realized then that my wife's $400 million wasn't the weapon. I was the weapon, and it was time to stop coaching and start playing. I didn't know it yet, but the stone bridge wasn't just a meeting place. It was the site of the original Montgomery Sterling betrayal, and it was where the final, bloody truth of our family was about to be unearthed. I didn't wait for Garrick to catch me. I didn't wait for the logic to kick in. I lunged across the gym floor, sliding on the worn hardwood until I reached Clara. She was clawing at her throat, her face a terrifying shade of blue-gray, her eyes wide and pleading. It's a sight that will haunt my dreams until the day I join Elena in the dirt, my daughter, the only piece of my heart left untainted, gasping for air while I stood there holding a bag of paper. "Garrick!" "Help her!" I roared. "Coach, get back!" A voice boomed from the back of the gym. It was Tuck's Marcus Montgomery, no relation, just a coincidence of name, who had been a star safety on my 2012 team and was now a lead flight paramedic for the county. He shoved me aside with the same raw power he'd used to break up screen passes. He didn't look at the water cooler. He grabbed Clara's hands, peeling them away from her neck. "It's not the water, Coach. Look at the handle." I looked. There was a faint, sticky residue on the silver lever of the water cooler. A contact paralytic. Vane hadn't poisoned the pipes. He'd just waited for the most predictable person in the room to take a drink. "She's not breathing," I screamed. "I've got her," Tuck said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He ripped an emergency kit from his bag, jammed an auto-injector of atropine into Clara's thigh, and began manual ventilations. "Garrick, get the coach out of here. He's the target. Vane is counting on the panic. Go." Garrick grabbed me by the collar of my jacket and hauled me toward the back exit. "You heard him, Silas. If you stay here, she's a target again. You go to that bridge. You end this. We'll keep her alive." I looked back one last time. Clara's chest gave a sudden, violent heave. She was breathing. Tux gave me a sharp nod. I grabbed the laptop bag with the vellum contracts and the ledger. I didn't feel like a 65-year-old man anymore. I felt like a landslide. I felt like the mountain that had swallowed Silverado Ridge. I got into the truck and drove toward the old stone bridge, the historic crossing where the Montgomery and Sterling lands used to meet a century ago. The bridge was a relic of a different era, gray, moss-covered granite arches spanning a deep, rocky gorge where the James River ran cold and fast. It was a place of ghosts. My Elena had told me once that the Sterlings had tricked her grandfather here in 1929, forcing him to sign away the mineral rights that started their empire. It was only fitting that the empire would end here, too. The Range Rover was parked in the middle of the span, its lights off. Jack's Vane was leaning against the stone railing. The magnesium flare he'd used earlier, now just a blackened husk at his feet. He was holding a remote detonator in one hand and a heavy-duty sidearm in the other. He looked like a man who was already dead, just waiting for his body to realize it. "You're late, Coach," Vane rasped as I stepped out of the truck, the ledger held high. "The girl is alive, Vane," I said, my voice echoing off the stone. "Your parlor trick failed." Vane chuckled, a sound like dry leaves. "It wasn't a trick, it was a distraction. I needed you to come here with the fire of a father, not the caution of a witness. Did you bring the contracts?" "I brought them. But I want the truth first. What is the burial ground? Why is Marcus Sterling so afraid of this land?" Vane looked out over the gorge. "The Sterlings didn't just make money from oil, Silas. During the Cold War, the government needed places to hide the things that didn't exist. Chemical agents, experimental fuels, the byproduct of 1,000 secrets. They paid the Sterlings to use the deep shafts of Silverado Ridge as a tomb. But here's the twist. The Sterlings didn't just hide it. They started harvesting it. They've been selling stabilized components of those toxins to shadow regimes for decades. That's why your wife had to die. She didn't just find a Ponzi scheme, she found the source of the Sterling's global influence." He turned back to me, his eyes hollow. "And the Caspian Protocol? It wasn't a gas pocket, Silas. It was a self-destruct for the vault. Your wife didn't sink a house. She buried a chemical arsenal 3 miles deep. Marcus Sterling is terrified because if the feds start digging in that sinkhole, they won't find oil. They'll find the fingerprints of 3 generations of Sterlings on the world's most illegal weapons cache." I felt the weight of the vellum in my hand. It was all there. The contracts weren't just for money laundering. They were for environmental maintenance, the euphemism they used for guarding the tomb. "Give me the papers, Silas," Vane said, leveling the gun. "I'm going to use them to buy my way into a country that doesn't have an extradition treaty. And you're going to go back to your daughter and pray the Sterlings don't decide to finish the job." "There's a problem with your play, Jax," I said. I pulled the coaching whistle from my pocket and blew it one long, piercing blast that shattered the silence of the gorge. From the shadows at both ends of the bridge, headlights flickered on. 6 trucks, all of them driven by the players. Garrick Vance stepped out of the lead vehicle, a long-range rifle slung over his shoulder. "You're surrounded, Vane," I said. "And the contracts? They're already gone." Vane's eyes went wide. "What?" "I didn't spend 20 minutes alone with the ledger to say goodbye," I said. "I spent 20 minutes using the high-speed scanner in Blackwood's Tahoe. The digital files were sent to every major news outlet in the country on a time delay. They went live 5 minutes ago. The physical papers in this bag, they're just bait." Vane let out a scream of pure, unadulterated rage. He raised the gun to fire, but he was too slow. A single shot echoed through the gorge, not from me, but from Garrick. The bullet struck the stone railing inches from Vane's hand, the spray of granite blinding him. Vane stumbled back, his boots slipping on the slick stone. He reached for the railing, but his injured arm failed him. I watched, almost in slow motion, as the man who had haunted my family for 4 years tumbled backward into the dark void of the gorge. There was no splash, just the long, fading whistle of the wind. I stood on the bridge for a long time, the whistle still clutched in my hand. It was over. The predator was gone. "Coach," Garrick called out, "we have to move." The bank. The First National Bank of Richmond was a Greek revival fortress on Main Street, its white pillars glowing under the city's streetlights. It was 2:30 p.m. The Sterling corporate offices were buzzing with the news of the leak. I could see the panic through the glass windows, assistants shredding papers, men in suits sprinting toward the elevators. I walked through the front doors, my ink-stained jacket a stark contrast to the marble lobby. 2 security guards moved to intercept me. "I'm Silas Harrison," I said, my voice booming through the atrium. "I'm here to speak with the branch manager. Tell him the head coach is here to settle the community trust." The manager, a man named Kensington, the brother of the lawyer I'd met in Richmond, came down the stairs, his face the color of sour milk. "Mr. Harrison, you're a wanted man. We've already called the police." "Call them," I said, slamming the ledger onto the mahogany counter. "But first open the account. Account number 77, Montgomery, Alpha. The authorization code is Silverado 1992. Kensington's hands shook as he typed the numbers into his terminal. He stared at the screen for a full minute, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. $412 million. That money belongs to the people of Richmond, I said. The Sterling stole it, and my wife took it back. I want every foreclosure in the last 5 years in this county rescinded. I want every pension fund that was liquidated by Harrison Sterling and Associates replenished in full, and I want the rest moved into a permanent trust for the victims of the Caspian projects. I don't have the authority to do that, Kensington stammered. The contracts in this bag say you do, I lied, patting the laptop bag. And the news crews currently pulling into your parking lot are going to want to know why you're hesitating. By sunset, the world had changed. Marcus Sterling was arrested at Dulles Airport, trying to board a private jet to Zurich. Julian and Caleb were taken from their protective custody and charged as co-conspirators in the chemical weapons cover-up. Because they weren't real Sterlings, the dynasty abandoned them instantly. They were left with nothing but the Harrison name, the name they had despised. I sat in the hospital room 2 days later, holding Clara's hand. She was weak, but the paralytic had flushed out of her system. She looked at me, a small smile playing on her lips. "We won, didn't we, Papa?" "We won, honey," I said. "But we lost a lot along the way." "We didn't lose Mom," Clara whispered. "She was there, the whole time. She was the one who gave us the map." I thought about Elena. I thought about the 34 years we'd spent together. I realized now that she hadn't lied to me because she didn't trust me. She'd lied because she loved the version of me that didn't have to know how cruel the world could be. She'd protected my soul at the cost of her own peace. I went back to the house in Richmond a week later. The yellow tape was gone. The news vans had moved on to the next scandal. I stood in the backyard, looking at the roses Elena had loved. They were wilted, the petals brown and curled. I picked up the garden hose and turned on the water. Don't be like me, friends. I say now, years later, telling this story to anyone who will listen. Don't let the secrets of the past keep you from seeing the truth of the present. I spent my life coaching boys to be men, but I didn't realize that the real game isn't played on a field with lines and referees. It's played in the quiet moments when you have to decide who you really are when the lights go out. My sons are in prison. They write to me sometimes, asking for money, for forgiveness, for a way back into the Montgomery legacy. I don't answer. Not because I'm vengeful, but because the man they're writing to doesn't exist anymore. Silas Harrison, the placeholder, is dead. I am the head coach of the Harrison Foundation now. We've rebuilt the north side, reopened the mills, and turned the old Sterling estate into a park for the children of the people they robbed. Silverado Ridge is still a crater. The government fenced it off, calling it a nature preserve. But I know better. It's a grave for a dynasty that thought they could own the earth without ever bleeding for it. Every Sunday, Clara and I visit Elena's grave. We don't bring roses anymore, we bring stories. Stories of the people we've helped, the lives we've changed, and the family we built from the wreckage of a lie. Because in the end, legacy isn't about the blood in your veins or the oil in the ground. It's about the people who stand by you when the mountain falls. It's about the truth you leave behind. And the truth is, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be.